Normally, to prove intent in a case of genocide, you have to get your hands on all the dusty archives of a government to find the secret correspondence and see what they were really up to. This climate of impunity has produced something here which is truly extraordinary, which is senior Israeli officials declaring publicly on the record their genocidal intent. You mentioned some of them, but we heard it from the president, the prime minister, senior cabinet ministers, senior military officials, think tanks associated with the government, where they openly have been declaring what would be genocidal intent, proof of genocidal intent in a court of law. And then you have the context, as I mentioned it, which was successive waves of genocidal action, of ethnic purging. You have policies that are designed demonstrably only upon the ethnicity of the target population. So none of these policies are carried out against Jewish Israelis. They're only carried out against Arab Palestinians inside and outside of the Green Line. You have collective punishment, which is a typical act which is carried out in these sorts of things, which is beyond dispute and well documented here as well. You have forcible transfers. So if you were writing the Raphael Lemkin story of genocide, you would list everything that we see happening here. Now, the classic response of large institutions and of the UN to avoid, the problem with genocide is it's always very politicized, right? So it will be declared in cases where it doesn't exist because it sounds like it has a lot of rhetorical value. It will be denied in cases where it does exist because, don't get us into trouble here. I remember very well, I was working in the UN when the US State Department, a memo leaked where they had given instructions to all of their diplomatic missions as the genocide was unfolding in Rwanda, not to use the word genocide because then they'll be compelled to act. And now again, you see questions before State Department and White House officials where they won't even enter into the conversation. And the reason is because there is an obligation under international law to act to prevent genocide. So you can't say, as we often hear from the UN and others, well, genocide has to be determined by a court of law. Of course, every crime has to be determined by a court of law ultimately. But you can't wait until there's a court verdict in order to take action on genocide, because the obligation under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it's called, is an obligation also of prevention. And if you're not able to call it out, there's no way that you can have an adequate response to the crime itself. So this is an extraordinary moment in history.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Longtime human rights lawyer Craig Mokhiber resigned from the UN over its failure to address what he called a textbook case of genocide in Gaza. He'd served as the director of the New York office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. His resignation letter made waves as it accused Israel of committing genocide against Palestinians and blasted Western governments and Western corporate media for complicity in the, quote, wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology and continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, which leaves no room for doubt or debate. Craig joined me to discuss what prompted him to leave when he did, the current Israeli assault on Gaza, the genocide label, challenges inside the UN on the issue of Palestine, and more. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full episode is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Craig, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Rania.
Well, it's really good to have you on, and there's so much I want to talk to you about, everything from your resignation to the things you talked about, the letter that you wrote, to the issue of genocide in Gaza and in Palestine more generally, as well as problems at the UN. But before we get into all that, I wanted to ask you about something that's been in the news a lot the last 24 hours, which is the announcement that there is going to be some sort of humanitarian pause. The Americans are saying about a 4-hour pause every day that'll take place. I'm not even sure when that will start. But of course, what most of the world has been calling for is a ceasefire. And the most we can get is a 4-hour pause. And so, from your perspective and given your expertise on these issues, what are your thoughts on the idea of a humanitarian pause?
Well, there's nothing humanitarian about a 4 hour pause, first of all. What this really is a kind of managed ethnic cleansing. This idea of a 4 hour pause, which does nothing to allow the actual evacuation of mass numbers of people, which itself, we've said over and over again, is a war crime. This sort of compelled movement of them, but just beyond the law of it, the morality of the idea of saying, I'm going to give you a head start of 4 hours before I start killing you again, is just one of the most cruel and cynical things that I can ever imagine. It seems clear to me what this is a fig leaf. I don't know if it's for the Israelis or for the Americans, but it is an effort to say that, look, we are making a concession here. A 4 hour pause in the wholesale destruction of a civilian population and its infrastructure is not a humanitarian act, and it is not in any way going to relieve the accountability of Israel for the crimes that it is perpetrating here. A ceasefire is the absolute minimum that anybody should be calling for. Happily, the UN has been calling for a ceasefire, but I don't think anybody should be fooled by these kinds of little theatrical measures like a 4 hour pause in the midst of the wholesale destruction of Gaza.
Another issue I wanted to get into, Craig, is before we get into the issue of genocide, is the fact that it seems like Israel is carrying out some sort of policy targeting hospitals. Hospitals are under attack. I don't even know the number, but I think more than half have been bombed, or the vicinities of them have been bombed. The largest hospital in Gaza, Shifa Hospital, is under constant threat of bombardment. There was, just before we're recording, there was bombing outside of the hospital and several people were killed. What do you have to say about the fact that it seems as though Israel's actively targeting hospitals? And is there precedent for this?
It seems rather unprecedented to have such a sustained campaign against medical facilities in particular. We've seen several hospitals destroyed, clinics attacked. We've seen the power cut off to these medical facilities. We've even seen the targeting of solar panels on the top of hospitals that says that this is really an effort to eradicate the availability of hospitals, which I suspect is another way of purging those areas of civilians, because for so many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the hospitals were viewed as places of refuge. On the one hand, you've got so many horribly injured people who need those services. And, others who have had their homes bombed out or living in terror, and they go to the hospitals thinking that it would provide some modicum of safety. I think that what's happening is they're being targeted in part for that reason. But I've never seen quite a pattern like this before. I know we're going to get to talking about genocide, but for me, this is another piece of evidence, because one of the very specific crimes that's listed in the Genocide Convention is imposing conditions of life that are designed to bring out a destruction of the population there. The systematic targeting of medical facilities is clearly a piece of evidence in that direction. It's not something I've seen before.
And then moving to the issue of genocide, I want to talk specifically about Gaza. Obviously, that's what's, the area that's being targeted the heaviest right now. But in your resignation letter, you noted that, you came to the UN in the 1980s under this impression that it was this very principled institution that had authority. But then you say today that under US and Israel lobby pressure, it's abandoned international law, particularly on this issue. And you write, and I'm quoting you, in a stunning historic irony that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the same year that the Nakba was perpetrated against the Palestinian people. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, we should do well to abandon the old cliche that the UDHR was born out of the atrocities that preceded it, and to admit it was born alongside one of the most atrocious genocides of the 20th century, that of the destruction of Palestine. And the reason I raise that is, I find it interesting that and important that this language of genocide in the case of what's happening in Gaza, I mean, I'd almost say it's become somewhat mainstream. At least it feels that way. It's being thrown around a lot more. People are discussing it in circles I have not seen it discussed before. But I do appreciate that you use that word to describe the foundational crime of Israel's creation against Palestinians. So before we get to the specific issue of Gaza right now, I'm curious if you could explain why why you use that language to describe 1948.
I mean, it's interesting because 1948, there's a sort of a double historic irony there. As I pointed out in that letter, that's the year of the Nakba and the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, which is the cornerstone for the entire international human rights mission and the marching orders of the office that I have worked for 32 years. But there was a third thing that happened in 1948, and that was the founding of apartheid in South Africa. And it provides a very interesting historical illustration of what's wrong with the international approach to Palestine. In the case of apartheid, even when Western states were still supporting apartheid, the US was still supporting apartheid almost until it fell. But the UN had maintained a constant pressure on the apartheid regime in South Africa based upon international human rights, international law, and on equality right up until the moment that apartheid fell. In Palestine, on the other hand, that approach was abandoned 30 years ago with the onset of the Oslo process, where international law and calls for human rights and equality and so on were suddenly pushed into the background in place of this amorphous political formulation that promised maybe sometime in the future a two-state solution, deference to political agreement between the parties, which always meant between occupier and occupied that you were deferring to Israel in those situations. And so when you look at 1948, you see both the contradictions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Palestine as compared to the program for South Africa. And you also see the context for the genocidal assault on Gaza today, because this is just the latest in a series of ethnic purges of the indigenous Palestinian population that started in 1948 with hundreds of thousands purged from their homes, brutally massacred, raped, murdered, and forced out of their homes in a classic case of genocide. And then successive ethnic purges after 1948 in the 1950s in various villages, obviously in 1967, now again this year, and then the incremental, obviously, ethnic purges that have been happening in the West Bank and in Jerusalem all along as well. So you can't understand the assault on Gaza except by looking at this consistent pattern of ethnic purges against the indigenous people of Palestine that have happened all along. And I think it also reveals what the motive of the Israeli government is in these purges. Clearly got nothing to do with hostages. They're dropping bombs on the buildings in which the hostages are living. So it's not about that. It's not about defeating Hamas, as they often declare, because very clearly they know they're not defeating Hamas with these kinds of wholesale assaults. They know that they're building Hamas and other resistance groups with all of the young people being born into these horrors who will demand to have a way of resisting in the future as well. The only way to explain it is as a wholesale destruction and purge, moving from north to south in Gaza as a continuation of what has been happening now for 75 years in the country. So I think that historical context is very important, even in a case before a court for genocide being committed in Gaza now.
And then right. And then moving on to the specific issue of Gaza, I mean, it does seem like there's almost a road to the genocide in Gaza specifically. I mean, when you say use the word unpeople, it seems as though the people of Gaza have been more dehumanized than any segment of Palestinians across historic Palestine or the various refugee camps that they live in across the region. And I mean, just thinking about the last, I don't know, 20 years, I go back to something that, and you might be very familiar with this, Craig, that Israeli demographer Arnon Sofer of Haifa University, he was the architect of this kind of current isolation of Gaza. And back in 2004, when he was advising the government of Ariel Sharon to withdraw from Gaza, and then seal the territory off with this horrible siege that's been going on for over 15 years. I'm just going to quote him real quick because what he said was a bit shocking. He said, when 2.5 million people live in a closed off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. He said this to the Jerusalem Post back in 2004. He went on to say, those people will become even bigger animals than they are today. With the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam, the pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, we'll have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. Now, that was back in 2004, and I can recall every single onslaught on Gaza, what the Israelis refer to, as I'm sure you know, mowing the lawn, whether it's 2008 or 2014 or 2021. there's always a bit of genocidal rhetoric coming from Israeli officials. I mean, back in 2014, during Operation Cast Lead, there was Israeli Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, who referred to Palestinian mothers as snakes who needed to be killed in their beds so they don't birth more snakes. She posted that very openly online with no repercussions. And that's just one of so many. I mean, and then even now, you have Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, explicitly talking about, we're going to impose this complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We're fighting human animals and we'll act accordingly. That's a direct quote. You have Netanyahu referring to genocidal Bible verses when he announced the ground invasion in Gaza. I mean, I could go on and on. It's almost like the list is too long. We end up spending an hour just listing Israeli officials expressing genocidal intent. But in the case of Gaza, I mean, can you just talk a bit about why that qualifies as genocide? I mean, given everything I just laid out as well.
Well, this what you're talking about is the sound of impunity. Because normally you don't have people making these kinds of public statements so openly without fear of any accountability whatsoever. And that is a kind of impunity that's been built up over many, many years, underwritten by the United States and by others who make sure that that impunity is a reality. I raised the issue of genocide officially in my letter while I was still serving in the UN, because I had never seen such a classic case of genocide, and I had witnessed the UN's failures in genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia and Myanmar, and now in Palestine. But I'd never seen such a clear case. Genocide happens in stages. It's all a part of a kind of a planned effort to destroy in whole or in part a particular group. In this case, you actually have, and again, I raised it as a human rights lawyer, quoting the Genocide Convention of the United Nations, which lists a number of acts of genocide and then lists the required intent. You've never seen such a close matchup as this. You see several of the prohibited acts have been perpetrated that are beyond dispute. Large-scale killing, intentional harm, including physical harm to the population. This idea of, and those are quite common when you see, genocidal assaults. But then you have this thing which is about imposing conditions of life that are designed to bring out the destruction of the population. You've never had such a clear case as that, as you do in the closure and siege of Gaza for all of these years, which is explicitly, and they have said so, designed in order to, to mow the lawn, to put the Palestinians on a diet, to make life in Gaza so bad that people will not want to remain. So you have an intentional interning of the population in a prison, what is effectively a prison. You have denying them adequate food, shelter, water, sanitation, healthcare, medicine, construction, freedom of movement, all of the things that are necessary for a decent life. As a matter of policy, intentionally denied to them. You don't often get such a clear case for the actus reus, for the acts that are required for the crime of genocide as listed in the Genocide Convention. And then you get to the point that you raised, which I've never seen. Normally, to prove intent in a case of genocide, you have to get your hands on all the dusty archives of a government to find the secret correspondence and see what they're really up to. This climate of impunity has produced something here which is truly extraordinary, which is senior Israeli officials declaring publicly on the record their genocidal intent. You mentioned some of them, but we heard it from the president, the prime minister, senior cabinet ministers, senior military officials, think tanks associated with the government, where they openly have been declaring what would be genocidal intent, proof of genocidal intent in a court of law. And then you have the context, as I mentioned it, which was successive waves of genocidal action, of ethnic purging. You have policies that are designed demonstrably only upon the ethnicity of the target population. So none of these policies are carried out against Jewish Israelis. They're only carried out against Arab Palestinians inside and outside of the Green Line. You have collective punishment, which is a typical act which is carried out in these sorts of things, which is beyond dispute and well documented here as well. You have forcible transfers. So if you were writing the Raphael Lemkin story of genocide, you would list everything that we see happening here. Now, the classic response of large institutions and of the UN to avoid The problem with genocide is it's always very politicized, right? So it will be declared in cases where it doesn't exist because it sounds like it has a lot of rhetorical value. It will be denied in cases where it does exist because, oh, don't get us into trouble here. I remember very well, I was working in the UN when the US State Department, a memo leaked where they had given instructions to all of their diplomatic missions as the genocide was unfolding in Rwanda not to use the word genocide because then they'll be compelled to act. And now again, you see questions before State Department and White House officials where they won't even enter into the conversation. And the reason is because there is an obligation under international law to act to prevent genocide. So you can't say, as we often hear from the UN and others, well, genocide has to be determined by a court of law. Of course, every crime has to be determined by a court of law ultimately. But you can't wait until there's a court verdict in order to take action on genocide because the obligation under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it's called, is an obligation also of prevention. And if you're not able to call it out, there's no way that you can have an adequate response to the crime itself. So this is an extraordinary moment in history where we see genocide, textbook genocide, as I said, unfolding in real time. The evidence, beyond dispute of what is unfolding there. Statements that declare that demonstrate just how strong the climate of impunity has become. And then you have, just to finish this line, the obligations in international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and the obligations in the Genocide Convention on other parties is not just to respect that law, but there are affirmative obligations for the US, the UK, European governments, and others actually to ensure respect, to use whatever influence they have to get the crime of genocide from stopping and to get the war crimes to stop. Not only has there been a direct breach by these Western governments of that obligation in international law, but they've actually risen to the next level of legal complicity. And remember, the Genocide Convention outlaws genocide, attempted genocide, incitement to genocide, conspiracy for genocide, and complicity in genocide is a crime under the Genocide Convention. And when you have a country, for example, like the US, that has been providing money and weapons and intelligence support and diplomatic cover and even the use of the veto in the Security Council while these crimes are happening, that is a case of legal complicity in war crimes and in genocide for which the US government should be held accountable under the rule of law.
Yeah, and you could say a lot of European governments as well. And European officials like Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, she's been one of the leading figures running around. She even visited Israel near the border wearing like a bulletproof vest and what looked like military gear, celebrating the attack on Gaza. I mean, in an ideal world, what would happen to these people? Like they'd be put on trial or they'd be prosecuted alongside Israeli officials?
There would be, absolutely. I mean, you would have. I mean, in the first instance, and I fully expect this to happen. At some point there'll be another UN independent commission of inquiry that will be mandated, that will investigate, that will document. It will come up with what we call the brown envelope, which is an annex that actually has a list of names of perpetrators, so that there can be judicial action subsequently. All the evidence will be laid out. I think there will be efforts to try to get some accountability in the International Criminal Court, which, as you know, has been dragging its feet when it comes to Palestine all along because of political pressure and its lack of independence in the prosecutor's office. But I think there may be some movement there. These are crimes of universal jurisdiction. You could have accountability in third state courts. If there isn't accountability in a tribunal, you could have a case in the International Court of Justice in the World Court, which is a state-to-state court that could have a finding of genocide that could then facilitate pursuing individual. It's not an individual criminal accountability court, but it would then provide a case for pursuing individuals in that. All of these things should happen, and we should all be encouraging it and supporting efforts for accountability for these crimes, including for those who are guilty of the crime of complicity. No question about it, because the whole international legal system rests upon the idea of combating impunity, of deterring countries and individuals from committing these kinds of crimes, because there's a likelihood that they will be punished. If we just allow it to, if we look the other way and allow that not to happen here and say, let's move back to the status quo ante and talk about this fake two-state solution, all these kinds of things, we can pretty much guarantee that we'll see continued crimes of this sort happening. So absolutely, there has to be a pursuit of accountability for perpetrators, for commanders, and for those who are complicit. And Europe, I mean, It's really an absolutely stunning thing. Of course, we've seen this consistently from the United States government, from the British government, but Europe and the European Union, and the kinds of statements and actions that we have been seeing, and the prohibitions against human rights defenders and peace activists, even demonstrating on behalf of the human rights of the Palestinian people and its ceasefire and so on, actually being prohibited in countries like Germany and France and so on, shows you the degree of complicity and what's happening. This is a moment in history that will be talked about for generations, and we will be all asked what we did at this moment. And there's going to be a lot of shame to be carried by Germany and by France and by the UK and by the US governments and by those who went along with this. But it's quite an extraordinary moment in history. We struggled a lot on human rights issues with Europe. Like, Europe used to be kind of the rock when it came to the UN human rights program. They funded it, they supported it, they provided political support in intergovernmental bodies. But Europe in recent years has entered into quite a contentious relationship with the UN human rights program because of their treatment of migrants, their treatment of ethnic minorities, waves of Islamophobia, and their action with regard to preventing protection in occupied Palestine as well. So it's quite a dark moment for the international human rights framework in political terms because it's being actively opposed. And
Right. Sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
please finish what
we
you're going
all
to say.
forever.
No, please go on more. It's good what you're saying. I was just going to note that with Europe, the other, just building off of what you were saying, on top of all that, they're justifying all of this within the framework of preventing another Holocaust and using the language of anti-Semitism and weaponizing weaponizing a historical memory that they were responsible for,
Right.
to justify the destruction of Palestinians, which is just, I can't really wrap my head around that, especially with Germany's behavior of all places. I
Germany
don't
is
know if you want to talk about that. Go ahead.
absolutely shocking, and it leads you to believe that they did not learn the lessons of the Holocaust, because we subsequently have seen them targeting other minorities, including Muslims and Arabs and others, and that persecution of those groups has reached a fever pitch during this war. And instead of being in solidarity with the victims in Gaza, what you see is a wholesale effort to silence not only peace activists and human rights defenders and so on, under the force of law and with the use of police, but specific statements by German government officials that are targeting Arabs and Muslims and telling them in particular how they need to be behaving during the situation. So I don't think Germany has learned the lessons. It's repeating its disgraceful approaches of the past. But where there is hope is hundreds of thousands of Germans marching in the streets at risk of arrest, daring the police to try to stop them from saying, this genocide must end, there must be a ceasefire, and the Palestinians and the human rights people must be defended. This really is very much where the hope is. But I think, when we're talking about Europe, one of the things that always struck me in the UN, one of the big blind spots on human rights work is settler colonialism.
Mm.
Colonialism everywhere. And the reason for that is because it has never been firmly rejected or addressed by the political groupings represented by the West. And it's very interesting because every other political regional grouping in the UN is literally a region. You have an Asia group, Asia Pacific, you have an African group, you have a Latin American group, and then you have this thing called WEOG. This is the regional group that includes Western Europe and other group. WEOG, it's called WEOG. It's Europe, and then it is countries established by European settler colonialism. That's the other group, which is to say Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. And previously, South Africa, when it was under apartheid, was a part of that group. And if you think that they even structure their engagement with international organizations in that way, it doesn't surprise you that not only is there this massive blind spot to the genocidal nature of settler colonialism just by its very nature, but it shows you their positioning on issues like indigenous rights, like minority rights, like the right to development, Palestinian human rights. I mean, these are the states that have most actively opposed the international human rights agenda in those areas. And that's another thing that needs to be righted in the way that international affairs inside the UN take place. It's like the worst kept secret in the world that this WEOG thing is the only group which is not regional, based upon, I don't know, whiteness. I mean, I don't know quite what the definition is.
That's interesting. There's a structure I did want to ask you about within the UN. I know you're based in New York, and you have been working from the office in New York. But I do have friends that work in various UN offices across, I guess I would say, the MENA region. And I've heard similar stories in other parts of the global south where the structure of the UN is very much where there's like the regional staff, or the local staff, I should say, the locals who work in sort of middle or lower level positions. And then all of the bosses are either, in the case of this region, well, I'm talking to you from Beirut, so I'm speaking of, where I am, I guess. But like in the case of the Middle Eastern region, a lot of the bosses are either European, or they're like Lebanese, but they have dual nationality. They're like born and raised or spent most of their time in some European countries. So they at least have that ideology of like that Western sort of arrogance, I guess, that can come with coming from the West at times. So it ends up getting enforced on the locals. And the reason I raise that now is because I've heard a lot of complaints about policing of their language and how they're allowed to talk about what's happening in Palestine, especially on their social media. And this is coming from, speaking specifically from Lebanon. I mean, it hasn't been in the news as much, but I'm sure like that Lebanon is at risk of an escalation should this horrific genocide in Gaza continue. And so people here are watching what's happening in Gaza, and they're hearing Israeli officials say, we're going to do in Lebanon what we're doing in Gaza, and we're going to send Lebanon back to the Stone Age. And it's quite frightening. And so then to be in a position where you're not even allowed to speak honestly about that, because some European or French person is like telling you what you can or can't say, it sounds like a replication of the sort of structure you're discussing, but like on a more micro level. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
Structural problems in the UN. I mean, first, what I want to say is that my letter was not a critique of the idea of the UN or the entire UN. There's nothing more heroic to me than some of the humanitarian workers, the human rights workers, development workers, and the more than 100 UNRWA workers who have been killed by Israeli bombs just in the last few weeks. And I am in constant and permanent solidarity with all of them and the work that they do, because they are the engine of the UN. These are people who actually believe in human rights and peace and development, inequality, those sorts of things. That's why they join. That's why they work there. They're the core of the organization. They've been abandoned by the political leadership of the organization. And there are also structural problems that you point out. So there is this tiered approach. We have local staff, national staff, regional staff, international staff, and so on, who are not treated the same. And there's been a move in successive years, including by the office I worked in, to remedy that. I remember when I was based in Gaza for a couple of years for the UN, and they used to have like a UN club there. It was called the Beach Club, right? And you were allowed to go in there if you were an international, but the Palestinian staff, who were the majority of the staff, were not allowed to go in there. And we lodged a formal complaint charging apartheid, in fact, all those years ago, and saying that is intolerable. And much to the credit of the office I worked for, there was an official complaint from my office saying, that's not sustainable. Either you close that place down or you open it up to all UN personnel. But so there are these kinds of structural problems. There's a structural problem at the top as well, which is, the leadership of the UN are political appointees who come directly often from governments. So, for example, the political department is always headed by an American from the State Department who comes directly from the government, is placed on top of the career civil servants, right? The peacekeeping department is always headed by a French person who comes from the French government. The humanitarian department is always headed by a Brit who comes from the British government. And similarly, the counterterrorism department is always headed by a Russian, and the development department is always headed by a Chinese. And these are government people, and they bring with them their government marching orders, right? So so according to the charter, you have to be independent. But if that's the way you are heading departments, that independence is pretty meaningless. We know that there isn't independence. And U.S. leadership of the political department has always been a big problem when it comes to the Middle East in particular, right? Undercutting of principled positions there. So there are structural problems with the organization that need to be resolved.
Does this explain why you wouldn't hear the word, for example, genocide be used by like the high-level officials in the UN, or even the word apartheid? I mean, a UN report, I believe at least one, has used that terminology, but you'll never hear Antonio Guterres say that. You won't even hear him. I mean, it took him a long time to call for a ceasefire. Um, and even after that, he was like, Israelis were demanding he resign, which was insane. But I guess that brings me to another question: is what is the pressure? And you mentioned this in your resignation letter, that there's this kind of pressure from the US, from the Israel lobby on the UN to police it, to basically make it, take away its authority when it comes to this issue in particular.
Yeah, the pressure is massive. It's organized. It's systematic, and it's been a present factor in the UN for decades. When I started, it was barely. I mean, the state pressure has always been there, but the Israel lobby pressure was barely discernible. But Israel lobby groups then invested a lot in actually setting up specific organizations whose whole job it is just to police the UN's approach to Palestine. That's all they do. And they do it in a couple of ways, but the most obvious tactic they use is by smearing UN human rights defenders, either the independent rapporteurs and commissions of inquiry or staffs. They've gone after me several times, other colleagues, in the most brutal of ways. I mean, they lodge complaints against you in the organization to try to get you forced out or cause problems with your career or whatever. And then the other thing they do is they smear you publicly. They say if you criticize Israeli human rights violations, you're an anti-Semite. And then they publish these things all over the place, and that unleashes all the crazies in the world who, they've done it to me in the last couple of weeks. I've gotten plenty of death threats and horrible smears and attacks. I've been called an anti-Semite. I've been, it just sort of unleashes this sort of ugly army of trolls out there that they have at their beck and call. And then the other thing that happens is because of U.S. and other pressure, there is much more access for organizations like AIPAC.
Mm.
That meets with every successive Secretary General together with
I did not know that.
and the agency and the Conference of Presidents of American Jewish Organizations, which, don't be fooled by the name. The agenda has nothing to do with Jewish people. It's all about Israel and Iran and these kinds of things. And they meet with successive Secretaries General. And yet that kind of access doesn't exist for Jewish Voices for Peace, for If Not Now, for organizations of Jewish people who are committed to the values of the UN, like peace and human rights and equality and all sorts of things. They don't have that kind of access. So there's that. And in my own case, I mean, this was a major factor in my decision to leave, is that pressure, so there's a constant pressure from the United States government, for example, to be silent on Israeli violations. So, U.S. ambassadors, when they go through their confirmation hearings in Congress, one of probably the main point that is emphasized is, will you defend Israel from any accusations of abuses? That's the litmus test when they appoint these ambassadors. And then when they come on board, the U.S. deploys massive resources just for the purpose of supporting Israeli impunity. We saw with WikiLeaks, during the so-called Goldstone Commission, memos that were released that revealed that the U.S. mobilized the entire diplomatic apparatus, every embassy and mission all around the world, and put them at work, we saw from the memos, trying to undercut, block, smear, and prevent the Goldstone Commission documenting Israeli atrocities and human rights abuses in that case. We see them do it in the budget processes, where the U.S. blocks progress on budgets if it includes anything that has to do with Israeli accountability, or frankly with the racism program as well that they oppose. So that pressure is very real. And then there's the démarche, where you make a statement and the ambassador the next day is in the office putting pressure on the high commissioner or on senior staff for these kinds of things. And all of that coordinated together with Israel government démarches and Israel lobby attacks on you. And of course, everybody knows what it's about and what's going on. But the truth is, it works. It creates a tempered reaction where you can contrast the adjectives used, the volume, the positions taken of the UN on Israeli violations to what is going on in other places, and you can see it's a completely different tone. And it's because of fear. It's because there's no denying it. And so my first letter to the High Commissioner that I raised after the atrocities happening in the West Bank in March, I was appealing for us to stand up to these powerful Western states that are distracting us from our core normative obligations, and to these lobby groups and smear campaigns. And that when it happens, I said we need to raise our voice, not lower it, because that's what speaking truth to power is all about. And we are abandoning the victims if we allow them to sadly know exactly what they're doing. And shame on us if we actually fall for it. I know it's not easy. It's hard. You've got a job to do. You're a senior UN official. You've got this full agenda. You're trying to work for human rights and so on, and you got to waste all your time. So please just quiet down so we don't have to deal with that. So it's very insidious in that way, and nobody likes to be. I've been in the international human rights movement for more than 40 years. I've done everything I can to fight bigotry of all kinds. If somebody calls me an anti-Semite, it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
I know the tactic. I know what they're up to, but it hurts. You're afraid somebody is going to believe that somewhere, and it's deeply, deeply offensive. And in my letter, I said we need to be very clear. The quote that I said was that criticism of Israeli human rights violations is not anti-Semitic any more than criticism of Saudi violations is homophobic, criticism of Burmese violations is anti-Buddhist, or criticism of Modi's violations is anti-Hindu, and that if any of those are true, then there is no international human rights framework, and we can all go home. But if it's only true with regard to Israeli violations, then I said that's a racist proposition because it means only Palestinians cannot have their human rights defended. And so that we need very strongly to push back against it. And thank goodness, there's so much solidarity from Jewish communities around the world in the United States, but elsewhere, who are standing up and saying, not in our name, we're not accepting this anti-Semitic trope that Israel tries to sell, that somehow it represents Jewish people, or that we're all a part of the same group. These groups like Jewish Voices, If Not Now, and others are saying very clearly, not in our name, not in our time. We're standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and we're demanding accountability for your atrocities. And that's stripping away this Israeli Hasbara propaganda point that if you speak up against Israel, you're an anti-Semite. These lobby groups that are set up to attack the UN in March, they put a bunch of their researchers to work to scan every statement I've made publicly and every tweet since the 1980s. They couldn't find a single utterance of anything anti-Semitic. So what they did was they consolidated all my criticisms of Israeli human rights violations, put them all together, and said, "Look, he picks on Israel." So
Jeez.
And my favorite one, Rania, my favorite one. There's this very notorious Israel lobby troll who's based in Canada, who everyone in the UN knows because she's very focused on attacking UN people in particular. And she issued this tweet where she said, look at him, he's an anti-Semite. And the proof that she used was to take the quote from my letter where I called for equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and said, therefore, I'm an anti-Semite. And so I answer her tweet, and I said, okay, you've outdone yourself. If calling for equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews is a new form of anti-Semitism, you have nothing left to talk about. A parody of yourself, and I'm blocking you. And it's really at that level. Of course, people don't believe it anymore, but it's out there, and it has that kind. People don't want to be burdened with that, and the UN will leave you to swing. I have many of my colleagues and special rapporteurs and others have been attacked in this way, and they've not been defended officially. What you get is statements. Oh, it's a special rapporteur. Well, they're independent; they speak for themselves, which is
like almost throwing them under the bus.
Yeah, if it's a staff member, it's either silence or, sorry, Mr. Israeli ambassador, sorry, AIPAC representative, who's just a staff member who's speaking out, but it's not necessarily the official position. So, and that's why these things work, because they create this kind of intimidation that silences people.
Of course, and it really it makes you wonder, what the threshold is. How many dead Palestinian children do there need to be for this to stop working right now? Just for this one moment, for this to not work. And I guess right now, and as we're recording this, it's 4,500. So that's not the threshold, sadly. I wanted to ask you about something else you raised in your letter that I think is also very important when it comes to the issue of genocide complicity. And that's the complicity of the Western corporate media. Which seems to have gone into overdrive this time around, much like what you just described, where there's this immense pressure at the UN against criticism of Israel. It's always there, but it does seem like they've lost the narrative because it's just so brutal this time around. And that's why you see a lot of these governments putting in place really restrictive measures. That's why you see the pressure ramping up. And I think it's also why you see the corporate media going into overdrive and defending the indefensible. But you reference Rwanda when you talk about that. and the role the radio station there played. So when we talk about media complicity, that's actually something that could be charged. No, like, can you talk a little bit about what that means, and why their role does matter in this?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the Genocide Convention says that people who commit these crimes can be held accountable, whether they are rulers, officials, or private actors. So this is not something that only applies to a head of state or something. It can be any actor who is involved. Secondly, the International Human Rights Framework. We have Article 19, which is the one that guarantees freedom of expression, freedom of the press, all those sorts of things. Absolutely essential. But there's also Article 20 that says that you have to prohibit incitement, propaganda for war, or incitement to violence or discrimination. So that's an obligation that extends, that imposes obligations on states to make sure that that's not happening with regard to private actors as well. So they are implicated here. And I was out of the country for many, many years. I spent much of my adult life outside of the country. And I remember coming back for the first time to be posted here after September 11th. I was ordered here by the then High Commissioner of Human Rights to come to New York, and I didn't want to come back for all sorts of reasons. And I came back and I started to watch the news, and I thought to myself, it's no wonder that there is such a total brownout of information on this is on foreign affairs issues in particular, and especially with regard to the Middle East. The level of ignorance in the American population is absolutely stunning. And the reason is because the misrepresentation of the situation on the ground by corporate media in particular.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.